The autumn rain hammered mercilessly against the diamond-paned windows of Ashworth Manor as Lady Eleonorze Ashworth stared at the marriage contract spread before her like a death sentence. The parchment bore the imposing seal of Duke Aleksandrem Ravencroft, a man whose very name sent shivers through London's drawing rooms. Her father's gambling debts had finally caught up with them, and she was to be the sacrifice that would save their family's crumbling honor. "You understand the terms, my dear daughter?" Lord Ashworth said, his voice heavy with shame and desperation. "The Duke requires a wife of impeccable noble birth, and we require his considerable financial assistance to avoid complete ruin." Eleonora's slender fingers traced the elegant script of her future husband's signature, each letter formed with the precision of a man accustomed to absolute control. Whispered stories in London's most exclusive circles painted Duke Ravencroft as a cold, calculating figure who had never shown the slightest interest in any woman. Some claimed he was cursed by a broken heart. Others insisted he simply possessed no heart to break. "When must I depart for Ravencroft Castle?" she asked, her voice maintaining its steady composure despite the trembling that threatened to betray her inner turmoil. "At dawn tomorrow. The Duke expects your arrival within a fortnight, and he is not a man who tolerates delays or disappointments." That night, Eleonora methodically packed her belongings with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Her devoted lady's maid, Margaret, wept openly as she carefully folded the wedding dress that had belonged to Eleonora's beloved mother, a magnificent creation of ivory silk and delicate Brussels lace, originally meant for a love match, not this cold business transaction that would determine her fate. The treacherous journey to Ravencroft Castle consumed 3 grueling days through increasingly desolate and forbidding countryside. As Eleonora's elegant carriage finally approached the imposing fortress that would become her prison, she understood with crystal clarity why the local villagers spoke of it only in fearful whispers. The massive castle rose from jagged black cliffs like a monument to eternal solitude, its towering spires piercing the perpetually gray sky like accusing fingers pointing toward heaven. The enormous iron gates opened with a bone-chilling groan that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth itself. Inside the vast stone courtyard, an army of servants stood in perfect military formation, their faces carefully composed into expressionless masks that revealed nothing of their thoughts. At their head stood a tall, commanding figure dressed entirely in black, Duke Aleksandrem Ravencroft himself, the man who now owned her future. Eleonora's breath caught painfully in her throat as she stepped gracefully from the carriage. The Duke was considerably younger than her fearful imagination had conjured, perhaps 30 years of age, with aristocratic features that appeared carved from the finest marble and eyes the color of winter storms. His dark hair was pulled back with severe precision, emphasizing the sharp, noble angles of his face. "Lady Eleonora," he said, his deep voice carrying the unmistakable authority of generations of noble blood and absolute power. "Welcome to Ravencroft Castle." She executed a perfect curtsy, meeting his penetrating gaze with the practiced composure her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "Your Grace, I am deeply honored by your gracious hospitality." Something indefinable flickered in his storm-gray eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her remarkable poise and dignity. He had clearly expected a trembling, frightened girl, not this composed young woman who carried herself like a queen despite her desperate circumstances and the uncertainty of her future in this forbidding place. The grand dining hall of Ravencroft Castle, possessed the capacity to seat 50 distinguished guests in magnificent splendor. Yet tonight, only 2 solitary places were meticulously set at the massive oak table that had witnessed centuries of Ravencroft family gatherings. Hundreds of flickering candles cast dancing shadows across the stone walls, where ancient tapestries depicted scenes of medieval hunts and glorious battles. Eleonora had deliberately chosen her finest evening gown, deep emerald silk that perfectly complemented her striking green eyes, determined to make an unforgettable impression on this enigmatic man who held her destiny in his powerful hands. Duke Alexander entered the hall precisely at 8 o'clock, his movements fluid and controlled like a predator comfortable in his domain. He had changed into formal evening wear that emphasized his commanding presence and aristocratic bearing. For several heartbeats, they simply observed each other across the vast expanse of polished wood and gleaming silver, 2 complete strangers bound together by legal documents and the crushing weight of family obligations. "I trust your chambers meet with your approval?" he inquired with formal politeness, as a perfectly trained footman pulled out her chair with practiced efficiency. "They are quite beautiful, Your Grace. The view of the gardens is particularly enchanting and peaceful. Those gardens were my beloved mother's greatest pride and joy," he said, and for the briefest instant his carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing something almost vulnerable beneath the surface. "She died when I was merely 12 years old." The unexpected admission hung between them like a delicate bridge that neither was entirely certain they wanted to cross. Eleonora sensed instinctively that this was not information he shared lightly with anyone, and she felt honored by his unexpected openness. "I am truly sorry for your profound loss. She must have been a remarkable woman to create such extraordinary beauty." Alexander's penetrating eyes sharpened, studying her face intently for any signs of false sympathy or calculated manipulation. Finding none, he nodded with something approaching respect. The following morning, Eleonora awakened to discover a note that had been discreetly slipped beneath her chamber door during the night. Written in the Duke's precise, authoritative handwriting, it granted her complete permission to explore the castle and its extensive grounds freely, with only the mysterious East Wing declared strictly off-limits to her wandering. This single restriction only served to heighten her burning curiosity about what dangerous secrets that forbidden section of the castle might conceal from prying eyes. She spent the entire morning wandering through room after magnificent room, each filled with priceless artwork and furniture that spoke eloquently of centuries of accumulated wealth and refined power. In the extensive library, she discovered rare first editions that made her heart race with genuine excitement and intellectual hunger. The Duke, it became increasingly apparent, was a man of exceptionally refined tastes and considerable scholarly learning. It was in the formal portrait gallery that she made her first truly significant discovery. Among the stern-faced Ravencroft ancestors who gazed down with centuries of accumulated authority, hung a painting that stopped her completely in her tracks. A young woman with extraordinarily kind eyes and a gentle, loving smile gazed down at her. The Duke's mother, without any doubt, for Alexander had clearly inherited her elegant bone structure and the graceful shape of her hands. She was breathtakingly beautiful, came a deep voice behind her, causing her to turn with startled grace. Eleonora turned to find Alexander watching her with an expression softer and more vulnerable than she had yet witnessed. "She appears to have been incredibly kind as well," Eleonora said with careful consideration. She was indeed, perhaps too kind and trusting for this harsh, unforgiving world. He stepped closer to the beloved portrait, and Eleonora caught the faint, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and something uniquely, powerfully masculine. She used to say with absolute conviction that true love could transform even the coldest, most frozen heart. "Do you believe that philosophy?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. 3 days into her residence at the imposing Ravencroft castle, Eleonora discovered the Duke's rigid morning routine through careful observation. Each day, at the first light of dawn, he rode out alone across the wild, windswept moors, returning only when the sun had fully risen above the horizon. On this particular morning, overwhelming curiosity finally overcame her ingrained sense of propriety, and she positioned herself strategically at her chamber window to watch his solitary departure. Alexander sat his magnificent black stallion like a man born to the saddle, his movements fluid and confident, displaying the natural grace of generations of noble breeding. Yet there was something telling in his posture, a tension that spoke of profound inner turmoil rather than mere physical discomfort. When he returned precisely 1 hour later, his face maintained the same carefully controlled expression, but his storm-grey eyes seemed somehow clearer, as if the solitary ride had provided some necessary release from invisible burdens. That afternoon, she encountered him quite by accident in the vast library, standing motionless before a tall window with a leather-bound book completely forgotten in his strong hand. He seemed utterly lost in deep thought, his usual vigilant wariness temporarily abandoned. For the first time since her arrival, she saw him not as the intimidating, all-powerful Duke, but as a man carrying burdens she could only begin to imagine. "Your Grace," she said softly, not wanting to startle him from his reverie. He turned with surprising swiftness, and she was genuinely surprised to see authentic pleasure flash across his aristocratic features before he could suppress it with his usual control. "Lady Eleonora, I didn't hear you enter. I was searching for something suitable to read. I hope I'm not disturbing your solitude." "Not at all," he said with unexpected warmth. He gestured gracefully to the towering shelves surrounding them. "Please, choose whatever interests you. I find myself genuinely curious about your literary preferences and intellectual pursuits." As she browsed the impressive collection, she felt his attention like a physical touch, warm and somehow protective. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for the following week, yet Alexander found himself increasingly reluctant to think of the remarkable Eleonora merely as a contractual obligation or business arrangement. She had been residing at Ravencroft for 6 transformative days, and already the ancient castle felt fundamentally different, warmer somehow, as if her vibrant presence had breathed new life into rooms that had served as mausoleums for far too long. He watched her from his private study window as she walked with unconscious grace through his mother's carefully tended garden, her glorious auburn hair catching the golden afternoon sunlight like spun copper. She moved with natural elegance, pausing frequently to examine the flowers with genuine interest and appreciation rather than the affected admiration he had witnessed in countless other ladies of his extensive acquaintance. When she looked up unexpectedly and caught him watching her with undisguised fascination, she didn't look away coquettishly as other women invariably did. Instead, she met his intense gaze directly and honestly, a small, mysterious smile playing at the corners of her perfectly shaped mouth. The simple, unguarded gesture sent an unexpected warmth flooding through his chest, a sensation he had thought himself incapable of experiencing. That evening at dinner, their conversation flowed with surprising ease and natural comfort. Eleonora spoke eloquently of her extensive travels with her late beloved mother, painting vivid, enchanting pictures of Italian galleries and the French countryside. Alexander found himself sharing carefully guarded memories he had kept locked away for years, precious stories of his childhood, his rigorous education, even his deepest fears about inheriting the enormous responsibility of the dukedom at such a young age. "You were only 22 when your father died?" Eleonora asked, her melodious voice gentle with genuine sympathy and understanding. 22 and completely unprepared for such overwhelming responsibility. I learned quickly that showing weakness invites exploitation. Yet you've built something truly remarkable here. The estate prospers magnificently, and your tenants speak of you with respect rather than fear. The night before their wedding ceremony, Eleonora found sleep completely impossible. She wandered the castle's ancient halls like a restless spirit, her silk nightgown and wrapper appearing ghostly pale in the ethereal moonlight streaming through the tall diamond-paned windows. The enormous weight of tomorrow's ceremony pressed upon her consciousness. After it, there would be no retreat, no possibility of escape from whatever uncertain future awaited her in this mysterious place. She found herself drawn to the enchanting conservatory, where brilliant moonlight transformed the exotic plants into a magical silver wonderland. The air was warm and humid, filled with the intoxicating perfume of night-blooming jasmine. She was so completely lost in troubled thought that she didn't hear approaching footsteps until a familiar voice spoke behind her. "I thought I might find you here," Alexander said softly. She turned to see him silhouetted in the doorway, still dressed in his elegant evening clothes, but with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled. He looked younger somehow, less formidable than the man who commanded absolute respect through sheer force of will and aristocratic authority. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted with complete honesty. "Tomorrow feels so final and irreversible." He moved closer with predatory grace, his penetrating eyes never leaving her face. "Are you afraid of me, Eleonora?" The use of her given name sent an electric shiver through her entire being. "Should I be?" "I don't know," he said with raw, devastating honesty. "I've never felt this before. What you've awakened in me, it's not something I know how to control or understand." The raw honesty in his deep voice made her heart race with dangerous anticipation. "What have I awakened?" He was close enough now that she could see the fierce conflict in his storm-gray eyes, the war between duty and desire, control and surrender. "Something I thought I was completely incapable of feeling. Something that makes me want to be worthy of you, not just your husband by legal contract." The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The wedding ceremony took place in the castle's ancient chapel, its weathered stone walls bearing silent witness to centuries of Ravencroft unions, both triumphant and tragic. Despite the intimate setting, only essential witnesses were present. The solemn occasion carried the full weight of tradition and dynastic expectation. Eleonora wore her mother's cherished gown, the ivory silk and delicate Brussels lace transformed by her natural grace and dignity into something absolutely breathtaking. Alexander waited at the altar in formal court dress, his aristocratic face carefully composed, but his storm-gray eyes betraying an intensity that made Eleonora's pulse quicken with anticipation. When she walked down the aisle with measured steps, their gazes locked and held with magnetic force, the rest of the world fading into complete insignificance. The ancient words of the sacred ceremony took on profound new meaning as they spoke their vows with conviction. When Alexander promised to love and cherish her, his deep voice carried a conviction that surprised even him with its fervor. When Eleonora pledged her faith and loyalty, she meant every word with a passion that would have shocked her a week ago. The moment the priest pronounced them husband and wife, something fundamental and irreversible shifted between them. Alexander's kiss was gentle but unmistakably possessive, acclaiming that sent heat spiraling through Eleonora's veins like liquid fire. She was no longer Lady Eleonorze Ashworth, but the Duchess of Ravencroft, bound to this complex, fascinating man by far more than mere legal documents. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair, but Eleonora noticed how Alexander's attention never strayed far from her. His strong hand found hers beneath the table, his thumb tracing hypnotic circles on her palm that made concentration nearly impossible. When he leaned close to murmur something about the wine, his warm breath against her ear sent delicious shivers down her spine. As evening approached, the reality of their wedding night loomed before them. They were no longer strangers bound by duty, they were husband and wife, and the attraction that had been building between them demanded acknowledgement. Alexander led Eleonora to the Duchess's chambers with ceremonial gravity, rooms that had remained sealed since his mother's death 20 years ago. Mrs. Whitmore had spent days meticulously preparing them, airing out the precious silk hangings and polishing the mahogany furniture until it gleamed like mirrors. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases, and a warm fire crackled invitingly in the marble fireplace. "These were my mother's rooms," Alexander said, his voice softer than usual, touched with reverence. I hoped you might find them comfortable and welcoming." Eleonora moved through the space with wonder, touching the delicate porcelain figurines and running her fingers along the leather spines of books that revealed the previous duchess's love of poetry and philosophy. She had exquisite taste. I feel deeply honored to occupy her chambers. Alexander watched her explore with fascination, noting how naturally she seemed to belong in these rooms that had remained empty for so long. When she paused before the portrait of his mother that hung above the writing desk, he moved to stand beside her. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "She always said that true nobility came from character, not bloodline." Eleonora turned to face him, suddenly acutely aware of their complete solitude and the significance of this night. The attraction that had been building between them seemed to fill the room like a living thing, making the air thick with possibility. "Alexander," she began, but he silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "I know this began as a marriage of convenience," he said, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "But what I feel for you now, it's anything but convenient. You've awakened something in me that I thought was dead." Instead of speaking, Eleonora rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her newfound feelings into the gesture. Alexander's response was immediate and passionate, his arms encircling her as if he never intended to let her go. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their carefully maintained composure finally shattered. The morning after their wedding night, Eleonora awakened in Alexander's strong arms, golden sunlight streaming through the windows of what were now truly her chambers. She had never imagined that duty could transform so completely into desire, that a marriage of convenience could become something so profound and beautiful. Alexander was already awake, watching her with an expression of wonder that made her heart flutter with joy. "Good morning, my Duchess," he murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good morning, my Duke," she replied, marveling at how natural the endearment sounded on her lips. They breakfasted together in her sitting room, the intimacy of sharing a private meal more precious than any grand gesture. Alexander told her about his plans for the estate, seeking her opinions with a respect that surprised and delighted her. When she suggested improvements to the tenants' cottages, he listened thoughtfully, making notes in his precise handwriting. "You have a good heart," he said, looking up from his notes with admiration. "I should have known that any woman brave enough to marry a stranger for her family's sake would possess such compassion. And I should have known that a man who maintains his mother's garden with such care could never be as cold as rumor suggested." Oh, they spent the day exploring the estate together, Alexander showing her every corner of his domain with obvious pride. She met the tenants, visited the village, and began to understand the scope of her new responsibilities. Everywhere they went, she noticed how the people responded to Alexander. With respect, yes, but also with genuine affection. That evening, as they dined alone in the smaller family dining room, Alexander reached across the table to take her hand. "I have a confession to make," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about you constantly since the moment you arrived. Even before our wedding night, I was lost. You've bewitched me completely, Eleonora Ravencroft." The use of her new name sent warmth flooding through her. "Then we are well matched, husband, for I find myself equally enchanted." 3 weeks into their marriage, Eleonora faced her first real test as the Duchess of Ravencroft. Alexander had been called away on urgent business, leaving her to manage a crisis with the estate's main tenant farmer. A dispute over water rights threatened to escalate into violence, and the local magistrate looked to her for resolution. Standing in the estate office, surrounded by maps and legal documents, Eleonora felt the weight of her new position. The farmer, a gruff man named Thomas Hartwell, glowered at her with obvious skepticism. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but this is men's business. Perhaps we should wait for His Grace's return." Eleonora drew herself up to her full height, channeling every lesson in authority her mother had ever taught her. "Mr. Hartwell, I am the Duchess of Ravencroft. My husband's business is my business. Now, shall we discuss this matter rationally, or would you prefer to explain to the Duke why his fields remain unwatered due to your reluctance to speak with his wife?" The farmer's attitude shifted immediately. Over the next 2 hours, Eleonora negotiated a solution that satisfied all parties, demonstrating a grasp of both legal principles and human nature that impressed even the skeptical magistrate. When Alexander returned that evening, he found her in the library, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I heard about the water rights dispute," he said, settling beside her on the sofa. "Thomas Hartwell sang your praises for an hour. He said you were sharp as a blade and fair as justice herself." Eleonora leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I was terrified I would make a mistake that would reflect poorly on you." My darling Duchess," Alexander said, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "You could never reflect poorly on me. Today you proved that my instincts were correct. You're not just my wife, you're my perfect partner." The pride in his voice made her heart soar. She had found not just love in this marriage, but purpose and respect. Their happiness faced its first serious threat when Lord Pemberton arrived at Ravencroft Castle unannounced. Alexander's former friend had always harbored resentment over Alexander's superior title and wealth, and the Duke's obvious contentment in marriage only fueled his jealousy. "My dear Ravencroft," Pemberton said over dinner, his smile not reaching his eyes, "you seem remarkably domesticated. Marriage suits you, though I confess surprise at your choice of bride." Eleonora felt the insult like a physical blow, but Alexander's response was swift and cutting. "My choice of bride demonstrates my excellent judgment, Pemberton. Perhaps if you possessed similar discernment, you wouldn't find yourself perpetually unwed and unwelcome in polite society." The tension in the dining room was palpable, but Pemberton wasn't finished. "I merely meant that Lady Eleonora, forgive me, Your Grace, comes from such reduced circumstances. Surely a duke of your standing could have aimed higher." Alexander's wine glass hit the table with dangerous force. "You will apologize to my wife immediately, or you will leave my house. Choose quickly." But Pemberton had achieved his goal. He had planted seeds of doubt about Eleonora's worthiness, reminders of the financial desperation that had led to their marriage. After he departed the next morning with a grudging apology, his words lingered like poison in the air. That night, Eleonora lay awake beside her sleeping husband, Pemberton's implications echoing in her mind. Had Alexander truly chosen her, or had he simply accepted what circumstances offered? Was their love real, or was she deceiving herself about his feelings? When Alexander stirred and reached for her, she allowed herself to be drawn into his embrace, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Love, she was learning, required not just passion, but constant faith in its reality. The next morning, she watched Alexander's face carefully, searching for signs that Pemberton's words had affected him too. The crisis came to a head when Eleonora discovered a letter in Alexander's study, correspondence from his solicitor discussing the financial arrangements of their marriage. The clinical language reduced their union to numbers and legal obligations, making her feel like a commodity purchased rather than a woman cherished. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, she confronted Alexander that evening in the library. "I need to know the truth," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Did you marry me because you had to, or because you wanted to?" Alexander looked up from his book, immediately sensing the gravity of her mood. "What has brought this on?" "Lord Pemberton's visit, the letter from your solicitor, the reality that our marriage began as a business transaction." She took a shaky breath. "I need to know if what we have is real or if I've been fooling myself." Alexander set down his book and moved to her, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Eleonora, look at me. Yes, our marriage began as a necessity. Your father's debts, my need for an heir. But what grew between us, like if that was never part of any contract? How can I be certain? How can I know that your feelings aren't simply convenience disguised as love?" Instead of answering with words, Alexander led her to his desk and pulled out a different letter, one she hadn't seen. "I wrote this to my solicitor 3 days after you arrived," he said, handing it to her. "Before our wedding, read it." With trembling hands, Eleonora read Alexander's instructions to his solicitor. He was to transfer a substantial portion of his personal wealth to her name, ensuring her financial independence regardless of what happened to their marriage. The letter concluded with words that made her heart stop. "I find myself caring more for this woman's happiness than my own convenience. Ensure she never wants for anything, whether she chooses to remain my wife or not. You gave me the power to leave you," she whispered, "because I wanted you to stay by choice, not obligation. Every day you remain here, every smile you give me, every moment you choose me, that's when I know our love is real." 6 months after their wedding, Eleonora stood in the same conservatory where Alexander had first confessed his feelings, but now she was not alone. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew. Alexander approached from behind, his arms encircling her as he pressed a kiss to her neck. "Penny for your thoughts, my Duchess," he murmured against her ear. "I was thinking about that first night I couldn't sleep when I wandered here and found you. Did you know then what would happen between us?" "I knew I was lost," Alexander admitted. "I'd spent years believing I was incapable of love, that my heart had frozen solid after my mother's death. Then you arrived with your courage and your kindness, and suddenly I couldn't imagine existing without you." Eleonora turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more precious to her than her own life. "Lord Pemberton was wrong, you know. I didn't marry beneath my station. I married far above it. Not because of your title or wealth, but because of who you are." "We both married exactly as we should have," Alexander said, his hand joining hers on her belly. "This child will be born of love, not duty. That's your gift to me, Eleonora. You've taught me the difference." As the sun set over the Ravencroft estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together in perfect contentment. Their marriage had begun with the words, "You will stay here only out of duty." But it had become something neither had dared to dream possible. In the distance, the castle bells chimed the hour, their sound carrying across the moors like a benediction. The Duke and Duchess of Ravencroft had found what so many sought but few discovered, a love that transformed duty into joy, obligation into choice, and two solitary hearts into one unbreakable bond. Their story would be whispered in the halls of Ravencroft Castle for generations to come, a testament to the power of love to triumph over even the most practical of beginnings.